Hello and welcome to this podcast. It's going to be an informal podcast, just covering some things that I've kind of seen a gap anyway that from the searches I've done on YouTube, and hopefully we can cover some of those issues in this podcast. We're going to cover trade and exchange, and we'll examine the economic systems of Bronze Age Mesopotamia and the Greco-Roman period. We'll analyse the evolution of the economic instruments, the laws, and we'll look at the variances and parallels of ancient economies. We'll also look at the role that societal classes across these eras played in trade and exchange, and we will do so using ancient evidence and secondary sources. When I say ancient evidence, I mean mainly either physical evidence, archaeological evidence, or potentially ancient literary sources. So, starting with early trade and the origin of trade in ancient Mesopotamia, it's a highly debated topic, both in its definition and in its inception and how it started. Garfinkel has a fantastic book on this, and he posits that trade emerged when merchants began to represent farmers to sell surplus grain and livestock resulting from animal husbandry, almost framing the earliest trade as being as brokers, which is an interesting way of thinking that brokers didn't come after trade, but they almost were the ones that started trade. However, Robbins, in his 1947 book, argues that trading is instinctive and it predates agriculture, it predates Mesopotamian society, and Sombart has a similar opinion, suggesting that the entrepreneurial trait, the desire to trade, is inherent in some people, and that trade has existed long before civilization was the glint in any human's eye. It was something that has been going on almost as a natural state of affairs for a very long time. You can decide which view seems more likely to you. Personally, I lean somewhat towards Sombart's view. But yeah, this is a topic we won't go into right now, but an interesting one nevertheless. Mesopotamia at the time was self-sufficient, as in it had everything it needed to survive. It had, at least on the alluvial plain, there was places to grow food. They had basic reeds and mud to build huts and houses. Survival wasn't an issue in Mesopotamia, and Gelb writes about this. Renger kind of emphasizes that trade was essential for certain scarce items, like plows, which were made of bronze, and obviously bronze had to the tin for bronze came from very far afield. However, when on closer inspection, Renger's scarcity is more a matter of scale, agricultural scale, rather than survival. As Gelb contends, Mesopotamia was self-sufficient, but Renger is right to say that if Mesopotamia wanted to be more efficient, wanted to be able to be more advanced, then it would have needed to look outside its own lands for certain technologies, especially bronze. Both Polanyi and Renger characterized the Mesopotamian economy as one based on reciprocity and redistribution, and it was focused on storage over investment and trade. So the kind of goal of the palaces and individuals at the time was to have as much storage as possible. It now seen as an inefficiency, an economic inefficiency. Back then, it was seen as almost the goal. The bigger your storage, almost the wealthier you were. There is extensive dispute about the extent of economic engagement of the average citizen. The traditional view is that most of the trade was done by or for the elites to acquire luxury goods, and it was them who advanced and fueled trade. But Foster, Oppenheimer, Reiner, they all argue for a symbiosis between the elite storage economy, which clearly was vital, and the private independent economic activity, which kind of takes us back to what Sombart and Robbins was saying earlier about the natural inclination that people have to trade. If people have surplus goods and someone else has something they want, there's a natural inclination to say, do you know what, can I have that, and I'll give you this in return. But what seems incontrovertible anyway, is that large volume trade was primarily carried out by palaces and the elites. So the people who were driving trade and the people who were driving advancements in far distant and quantity trade were definitely the elites and the palaces, and it was them who necessitated the recording of transactions, inventories and debts, which we know propelled the development of writing in the late 4th century. So, I mean, to those who know, it's kind of almost common knowledge, but to those who don't, it's kind of disappointing that writing was the result of record keeping and nothing more exciting like storytelling or myths. However, the development of writing, which would later allow trade to grow in an exponential way, was definitely driven by the elites and palaces trading in large quantities and therefore needing to be able to somehow record it. By the time writing shows up in the archaeological records, we already know and we already see a fully developed system of weights, measures, timekeeping, and foundational mathematics. This is a very interesting and long discussion, which is definitely worth having. However, this wouldn't be the place or time for it. But it is, it's very interesting how the first systems of weights and measures came along. You could take measures back to something as simple as just counting 1, 2, 3. But obviously, the whole system and timekeeping that came with it, and then obviously once you have weights and measures, the basic mathematics and then more complex mathematics. Like I say, that's a really interesting topic that maybe for a future podcast or just for general future reading for those who are interested. As this trade increased, so too state power grew, and with state power and trade growing vitally, so too did the merchant classes. They were the first professions to be independent from the temples and the rulers, mainly because merchants, by definition, frequently crossed borders, and this kind of a business allowed them to operate, to a certain extent, beyond the direct control of any single state authority. We'll discuss later how this independence almost predated the states in many ways, but we see this autonomy highlighted in the famous tablet you can go and see in the British Museum. It's pretty incredible. It's just sitting there. I mean, lots of incredible stuff are just sitting there, but this tablet, which is so incredibly important and quite famous, it's just sat there. You can go and read it. I think it's on the 2nd floor in the British Museum, It's the Ir tablet. And you see the writer really being quite annoyed that a merchant who he hired to ship him a load of stuff had basically put himself out of the reach of the state enforcement mechanism. Essentially, he went abroad, so he gave this guy some substandard goods, and then when he wanted these goods, when he wanted to complain about the goods he had received, he went outside state control. Now, why is that important? Well, what we'll do is we'll quickly go through what happened in this tablet, and then you'll see that he's kind of almost subverting the state. He's at least kind of duped state authority, which was at that time not something to be taken lightly. And then it says, speak to Ir Nasib. So the way they used to write these things was almost like in first person, saying speak to Ir Nasib. Thus says Nani. So Nani is the one who's writing the letter, and the person he's writing to is Ir Nasib. And essentially, in this we see also the quantity of trade that we're dealing with. He essentially asked him, please go and take this money and give me 500 grams of silver. Sorry, take this 500 grams of silver and please give me essentially around a ton of copper. And it says, you alone have treated my messenger with contempt, because the 500 grams of silver that you took from my house, you talk in this way, while I, on your behalf, have given to the palace 540 kilogram of copper, and Sumi Abum has given 540 kilogram of copper. Apart what was written, so they made the contract. It's apart from what we have written on a sealed tablet, which we left in the temple of Samas. So they obviously made a contract, and they left that contract in a place they both trusted. It says, you have withheld my purse in enemy territory, and it's up to you to return my purse to me in full. Now you'd think that that would be a capital crime. However, he says, from now on, I will not accept bad copper from you. And in my own courtyard, I myself will select and take the ingots, because you have treated me with contempt. And if you do this again, I will inflict grief upon you. Essentially, what he's saying is, he's ordered 540 kilo of copper, he's paid 500 grams of silver for it, and he got substandard copper. He wants to. He's got a contract. He wants to enforce his contract or complain about the quality of the copper. And Ir Nasib is nowhere to be seen. He has run away, and he's run somewhere where he can't be compelled by the state to comply. But instead of essentially wishing on him death or something quite extreme, which probably would have happened to anyone else, because he's a merchant and semi-independent from the state, he says, well, from next time I will select the copper myself. He's obviously not happy. Remember, Nani is buying this copper on behalf of the palace, the only people who could afford this kind of quantity of copper. And so essentially he's conned the palace and gotten away with it. Merchants operated within a familial network that probably predated any state and remained separate from state control for many hundreds of years to come. And they maintained a decentralized trade hierarchy, often even small military powers, like small military units that went together with these familial networks, whilst at the same time in the wider world empires were consolidating territory and physical force under empires. These families kind of stayed out of direct control by these consolidations of power. and due to their necessity, no one could really pin them down too much, and obviously due to their mobility. These merchants were crucial not only to the massive surge in trade, which was to come, but also for state efficiency, because often they served dual roles. They were business operators, but also palace administrators. They had specific sets of skills like mathematics. They were the ones who exchanged weights and measures between different cities. All had their own weights and measures and times and calendars. They had a very unique set of skills, and the state needed them. States and merchants were interdependent. The state needed the merchant services, and obviously merchants benefited from the business the state gave them, but also something much more important, which was state security and an economic regulatory framework. So the state brought along a regulatory framework that comprised of laws, but it also comprised of weights, measures, standards. So everyone within that empire or everyone within that city all used the same weights and measures set by the rulers, and obviously that's massively beneficial to any kind of trade. So there was this interdependence between states and merchants where one could not exist without the other. We see that independence on that letter from Nani, and the palace representative in Nasir that we saw before, that despite Nani's insistence that he had been conned, he only said he would reject future poor quality copper, showing that there was not much he could do due to how integral people like that were on the state. You have to understand, this copper came from Dilmun, which is now Arabia, very far away. Ships were required, long distance trade. These families had connections in all these different faraway lands, and they were vital and important to everyone, that these connections were maintained. And if you got rid of one of these merchants, obviously you're messing with the whole family. You could then be cut off from a very vital source of a vital resource, metal, in this case copper. And without copper and without tin, you don't have bronze, which would have been catastrophic. Which obviously gave them some leverage at a time where very few had leverage from these very tyrannical rulers that ruled at the time. Traders' success depended on stable trading environments, which were upheld by rulers. As we said before, they defined weights, measures, and calendars within the state, and they created a uniform economic system. However, more recent analysis by Herman, Ramsdorff, and others suggests that the variety of weights used in the region may have originated from a single standard unit. So, till recently, it was assumed that each city kind of came up almost out of thin air with their own ideas of weights and measures. However, a really interesting analysis which you can check out suggests that all these different weights and measures from this region actually may have originated from a single, much older unit, which also takes back the idea of units, weights and measures much further back in time. Again, another side, really interesting topic worth reading up on. So far as I remember, Herman Ramsdorff, Longo 2021. Have a read if you have the time. The Hammurabi Code, which is one of the most famous, extensive surviving examples of law from the Mesopotamian period, or at least from around this time, obviously was not the first. It's not the first we even have access to, or that we have dug up, but it's the most extensive surviving example anyway. And the Hammurabi Code addresses many societal issues, which kind of reflects the state's expanding role as the state evolved. Um, but if you boil down all the different laws within this code, they have two primary objectives. One is to protect the vulnerable from the powerful. So if you steal from someone, you can be held to account. And it was to safeguard personal property. Again, stealing is another great example. So, like I say, you can read through this list. It's quite interesting. It's also the origin of where we get an eye for an eye, so far as we're aware, and many other kind of concepts of justice that we have passed down for many generations. But what it does is underscores the necessity of state guardianship for trade to thrive. And again, it reinforces this reciprocal relationship between the rulers and the merchants. So the state creates the conditions that are conducive to trade, and the merchants were obviously essential to the state's operations, both in terms of providing the goods and bringing stuff into the state, like copper and other essentials, but also in terms of like we said before, they actually did the administration. They were actually ones sitting there writing these tablets and making sure everything was present. The Hammurabi's code, as far as we're aware, dates back to around 1758 BC. So, like I said, about nearly 4,000 years ago. Being more precise, we're talking 3,758 years ago. And it's a really pivotal document which highlights the state's crucial role in shaping a conducive economic environment by the implementation of a legal framework for trade. Many of the laws introduce economic instruments that we don't really see before. So in this code, we see essentially a legal compilation which addresses property rights, contractual obligations, debt management. It reflects really a maturing economic environment. So trade has become much more complicated. We now have obviously property rights, contracts, all sorts of kinds of debt, complex, increasing complexity in the kinds of economic interactions that are happening. And with that comes the detailed regulation. And the code anticipates many other things like issues of financial risk, as you can see with provisions for unpredictable events like crop failure. And it also signifies an early understanding of economic contingencies. It also has a delineation of wages for different professions, and it tells you how much each profession deserves to be paid for their job. And it also has punitive measures for professional malpractice. Some of them quite grotesque and barbaric, but essentially it's almost setting an expectation, and it suggests an awareness of the value of skilled labour, and it also suggests a move towards a more specialised workforce where people have very specific tasks and specific capabilities. So if you look at or embedded within Rule 23, like I say, it's very easy to find this online in English, and it's quite easy to read and really very interesting. What you have there is an early form of state guaranteed asset protection. In Rule 56 and 117, we have introduced the concept of liability and recompense for negligence. Again, liability are really an advancing economic instrument here, a legal instrument which is in a sense an economic instrument too. And again, Rule 56 and 117 also discuss debt recovery, which lays the groundwork for later liability and indemnity law, which we take for granted today. Not an interesting part of law, I would suggest, but really vital for trade and for as an economic instrument. Really starts very early on. Number 42, Code 42, establishes minimum pricing. Again, maybe for those who are more economically liberal might not see this as a very useful economic tool. However, it indicates that the state already had a regulatory role in the economy, and it was attempting to ensure fair trade practices. The code also extensively covers property rights, contracts, credit, debt, legal records, transaction diligence, theft, reclamation, restitution. So what we have here are really all the fundamentals that our economic system is based on, starting here all these years ago. Really, they go very far back, and it just shows you just how sophisticated trade was becoming nearly 4,000 years ago. Collectively, these laws not only regulated the commerce at the time, but they were the groundwork for future economic expansion and the legal sophistication that was to come later on. And in many later codes and many later laws, including the Bible, you see ideas which are just directly ripped off from this code. So really quite a... I mean, the Bible was written... I know this is controversial, but the Bible was probably written about 1,000, about 1,000 years later, and it still had... That's how long the echoes of this code were. We see an eye for an eye and many other economic ideas which are either directly ripped off from this or ripped off from copies of this over the years. At that time, transactions were conducted using tangible commodities. So we don't have money yet, we don't have coins, but they're using silver and grain as a medium of exchange. But it didn't act as investment capital. Now, according to some, like Sweet, it wasn't used as what could be defined as money either. However, Foster disagrees, and I think on balance Foster is much more correct. It's my personal view. And, well, to quote him, he says, quote, "It may be considered money in the usual sense because it was used like money." He notes that commodities are often priced in silver, and we see a silver balancé text from Lagash, where there is some tax farming going on, and these tax collectors are forced to convert the raw materials they are paid in. So they go to collect the taxes, and they are paid in all sorts of different commodities, but they have to then convert that into silver, which is essentially using silver like money. Silver was also often stored as a means of savings, like Esnuna, who had silver savings account in Uruk and Subo, suggesting silver was acting like money in a way that many other commodities weren't, which, going back to Foster, seems he's essentially saying it may be considered money in the usual sense because it was being used in many ways like money. So this gives you some idea or some really basic overview of about where trade was at this time, how sophisticated trade had become, the road that trade was on at this time, where it had come from. Like I say, this topic is endless, really very interesting, and this could be a much longer podcast. I'm trying my very best to stay on topic, which is something I'm not very good at, and just to give an idea or an overview of what the economy looked like around this time. around 1700 BC. But if we are to then just jump a little bit to the 7th century, to the Greco-Roman period, we start with a big jump in terms of economic development, which is the first evidence of coinage which we have, which is from Lydia in the 7th century BC. And obviously this would have revolutionized economics. Coinage streamlines transactions, it enhances efficiency and economic activity, it enables precise economic records and planning, it lowers transaction costs, and it contributes to the development of a credit system and banking. It just makes everything more efficient and easier to do. And additionally, coinage offers governments a tool for monetary policy, including inflation management, which further stabilizes and can stimulate growth. So the next big source we have, which really goes into quite a lot of detail about the advanced state of economic understanding that had developed by this time, can really be found in Xenophon in ways. Xenophon is worth reading for many reasons, but if you were to strip out the context and just look at what economic principles he is shown to understand, you see a massive evolution or a massive jump or contrast from the Bronze Age economics that we had been dealing with up until now. His work suggests really a shift towards an advanced understanding of public infrastructure's role in trade facilitation. So if you build a good port and it's easy to use, people will come. He talks about the concepts of public-private financial partnerships, state investments with high interest returns, talks about public land utilization for revenue. He also shows a shift from centralized control to a broader inclusion of public participation in economics, and just generally an increased sophistication of economic tools and theory. Xenophon's focus on labor dynamics with regards to silver mines reveals a market-responsive labor system, whilst highlighting the understanding for the potential of economies of scale. So when you look at the things he's talking about, what you can see straight away is the depth of understanding of economics required for these ideas to present themselves in the way they do. Additionally, Xenophon's ideas for diversifying state revenue through various forms of income indicate he has an understanding of macroeconomic risk mitigation. And these proposals, together with strategic economic considerations for resilience, for economic resilience, in their case wartime resilience, also underscores a real maturation or maturity of economic planning and resource management. From a similar period, we have Demosthenes, and he offers a slightly different insight to that of Xenophon in terms of the angle he's coming from. But he reveals a nuanced economic reciprocity, particularly in international relations, as he has this. You can look at it as Demosthenes 20 to 24, where he's talking about an international agreement with Bosporus. Demosthenes also underscores the economic impact of legal rulings, and he stresses the importance of public trust in a dependable legal system. And he understands a dependable legal system to be an intangible economic asset. Really key. He's starting to understand that the environment, the stability of the environment, the legal environment is also an economic asset. Demosthenes also describes an evolved legal system which supports economic stability, which is marked by stuff that we really would recognize today: professional advocacy, the presumption of innocence, a focus on evidence. It's really quite a rigorous legal structure, and it also has references to laws and precedent, which is really a titanic advance from the Bronze Age Hammurabi's Code. And you can see that this enhances economic activity through a reliable rule of law. And this influence is obviously spread later through the Hellenic tradition throughout the world. The Mediterranean Sea, with its geographical position, also enabled the movement of bulk commodities and raw materials with much greater ease than Mesopotamia. So the Greco-Roman world is obviously based around the Mediterranean. It's kind of its local pond, its local sea, and having your centre of trade there made life very, very much easier for trade. The problem Mesopotamia had was the rivers ran south, and unlike the Nile, which the river runs towards the sea, in which case, in the Nile's case, it was north. You could travel both ways on the Nile because you had the wind blowing one way and the flow flowing the other. In Mesopotamia, the rivers flowed south, but the wind would not take you upstream. So the ability to trade up those rivers was really compromised. As an example of something that was impossible in the Mesopotamian period, is you couldn't sell grain over long distances up north, because the amount of grain it would take to feed the horses that had to drag the grain up north, which couldn't be sent by boat, would, at certain distances, the grain it would take for the horses or the donkeys to survive would be greater than that of the grain you're trying to ship. Similar, as well, on top of that, you also start to see that the higher up the river you are, the better control you had over trade in the region. And you see in the Assyrian Empire, like with Nineveh, the balance, or the center of power kind of goes upstream for a while, and then later shifts again. Obviously, so in the Greco-Roman periods, you have the Mediterranean, which makes trade very cheap, and this was also later enhanced by the Roman road system, which was well protected from banditry, which also significantly eased the flow of commerce. In the Roman times, we have the equites, which, just like in Mesopotamia, played a real pivotal role in administration. We see equestrians frequently assume the roles of procurators or financial overseers of provincial administrations. A good example would be Sextus Julius Possessor, who was entrusted with the management of accounts, such as those pertaining to African and Spanish oils. And additionally, they also served as prefectus annone, overseeing Rome's grain supply. So you see there the equites really involved in the administration of the Roman state too. So this idea of merchants playing this kind of dual role, this happens over a vast expanse of time, and you could probably argue happens still today. The Roman economy, however, in contrast to the previous economies, starts to display clear characteristics of a market economy. Yes, this is quite controversial, but I'll discuss in a second. On balance, I think that's the case. Goods were traded based on fluctuating prices, and they were responsive to the broader Mediterranean economic conditions. And you can read this in Temin. Like I say, it is definitely a topic of substantial scholarly debate. Polanyi says that, or posits that, Rome's economy was a substantivist economy, and Finley labelled it a command-based economy, whilst Hopkins saw it as primarily as a slave economy. However, Temin and other more recent scholars support the view of a market-driven economy, which to me seems the most plausible considering the data on grain and oil prices throughout the empire, being very reactive to prices across the empire. And again, this is quite an interesting topic that you can really go into. Like I say, a thorough analysis of this evidence is probably beyond the scope of this podcast, but definitely worth a read. I would recommend reading Temin, but obviously Finley, Hopkins, and Polanyi are also worth a read on this topic. We also see the advancements in banking, as indicated by the use of ledgers for managing deposits, and it represents a shift towards sophisticated economic practices. This innovative financial infrastructure is referenced by Plautus and analysed by Andrea 1999, and it really facilitated monetary transactions absent of physical currency exchange. Essentially what that means is I could give you money through one account to another account with no physical money involved. This is really a titanic leap in economic sophistication. We have what's called the Museris Papyrus, and we also have the Isundus wax tablets, which were found in Pompeii, and these are both a window into the multifaceted nature of Rome's financial instruments. We have the emergence of brokers, inventors that transcend direct stakeholders' involvement, which obviously massively broadens economic participation. We also see the introduction of sea loans, which there's evidence for earlier on in this too, but is very clearly spelled out in the Museris Papyrus, which also underscores a real good understanding of risk, with risky loans being compensated with correspondingly higher interest rates. We see that these more complex financial instruments are also coupled with a legal framework to support them. So you see the evidence from the Museris Papyrus. You see many of the legal remedies if things were to go wrong. So the Greco-Roman legal system was intricately tied to economic activity, and you had detailed regulations on credit management, debt settlement, contract enforcement, that really demonstrate an economic and legal sophistication that obviously far surpasses anything we saw in the Bronze Age. This advanced legal structure is very adept at addressing commercial disputes. We see in Ulpian's treatment of liabilities, they have this real question of, if I sell you wine and that wine spoils, whose fault is it? And it's really actually quite interesting if you read the details of how they try and figure out. It's essentially like, if I sell you a printer and that printer breaks, for how long after buying that printer is that your fault? Etc. etc. Really quite, again, interesting kind of. It's an interesting insight into the advanced ideas of liabilities that were around already at that time. It really reflects quite a mature framework, which was real crucial for capital formation, risk management, and it facilitated massive economic growth. So, like I say, it's not the most comprehensive podcast you'll ever listen to on the topic. It's meant to be quite basic. But if we reflect on Mesopotamia and the Greco-Roman era, you see this massive transformation in economic practice and theory. You see Mesopotamia's limited, elite, directed trade based on agricultural surplus, to the Greco-Roman period's intricate market economy and refined economic tools, and it just exemplifies a real development in the ancient economic frameworks and management. But there are some similarities, because both Mesopotamia and the Greco-Roman societies recognize the essential symbiosis between commerce and governance, and they both fostered a interdependence between the states and the merchants, which was crucial for their whole economic systems. And this underscores how challenges like ensuring trade stability and legal frameworks and state merchant interdependence persisted throughout the time. Like I say, I would love to do a much more comprehensive, much clearer. I know this podcast has been a little bit bitty, a little bit jarring at times, or a little bit abrupt at other times. The flow is not smooth. I'm just looking at many bits of notes and little bits that I've written over the time, just trying to kind of draw out some of the bigger, more obvious differences that we're dealing with. But yeah, basically what we have there, I'll probably leave it here, and for those who already have knowledge on the topic, this might not prove to be super useful, but for those who really have started from scratch or just trying to get a real basic idea of economic systems at the time and how they differed or compared, hopefully this could be of some use to you. Thank you very much for listening.